Hi everyone. So in today's video we'll be talking about a topic that has personally interested me for a long time, and that is the topic of were ancient people in good shape? Were they really muscular like we've seen in some movies such as 300 or the Spartacus Blood and Sand series, where the actors portraying those ancient people were in pretty good physical shape. So basically in this video I wanted to explore whether or not this portrayal is realistic, and just talk about what kind of information we have in regards to the physical exercise that ancient people did, their diet, and so on and so forth. Also, I believe that I'm the right person to make this video because aside from being a student of history and someone who makes videos, I am also a competitive powerlifter, and later on in this video I'll be talking about some basic concepts of physical training and nutrition, and I as an athlete believe that I'm more qualified to talk about those concepts and explain them better than someone like, say, the armchair historian, for example. Also, I want to add that this is an incredibly broad topic and I will only be talking about topics that I have selected myself. So if you think that I missed anything important or you would like to add something to the arguments that I brought up, of course you can let me know in the comment section. So without further ado, let's move to the first part, the first topic that I have chosen for this video, and that is the ancient Greeks. No man has the right to be an amateur in the matter of physical training. It is a shame for a man to grow old without seeing the beauty and strength of which his body is capable. Socrates, allegedly. So this is a great quote that I personally like, and it's a quote that has been quite popular on the internet, and it has been used as kind of a like a short sentence to kind of summarize the attitude of the ancient Greeks when it came to physical training. But I think that this is a huge oversimplification of how the ancient Greeks felt about training, and it doesn't really prove that they were, a bunch of bodybuilders walking around. So I decided to dig a little bit deeper, explore this quote in a little bit more context, and also expand on the topic of physical exercise in ancient Greece. And as I already mentioned, the attitude of the ancient Greeks towards physical training. So when I read this quote, I said that it's a quote by Socrates, allegedly. Why is this? Well, first of all, what's interesting about Socrates is that he's one of the most renowned and respected philosophers of ancient Greece, but he never actually wrote anything himself. What we know about Socrates comes from his students, and this quote in particular comes from a student of his named Xenophon. More specifically, his memorabilia and the exact chapter where you can find this quote is Book 3, Chapter 12. And I'm bringing this up because this has kind of caused a little bit of contention around this quote, because some people are saying, well, we don't know if that is actually how Socrates felt, or if this is just one of his students projecting his own views onto Socrates. And of course, we can't really know what the case is. We can't know for sure that this is how Socrates felt, or if this is just Xenophon using Socrates' name to express an opinion or a view that he himself held. But regardless of whether or not Socrates actually said this or didn't, it's a very popular quote, so I wanted to dig a little bit deeper. And so I read the whole chapter to kind of get a little bit more context for this quote. So the chapter is basically a dialogue between Socrates and a young man called Epigenes. The chapter starts by Socrates noticing that Epigenes is not in very good shape, and he basically tells him that he's not in good physical shape and that he should do exercise in order to improve his physical condition. Epigenes responds telling him that he doesn't believe that he should do physical exercise because he's not an athlete. And the rest of the chapter is basically Socrates telling Epigenes how it isn't just athletes who should be doing physical exercise, but everyone should be doing physical exercise because it can be beneficial in many different ways. And one of the examples that he gives is that it makes men better soldiers, and that it is the responsibility of every single man to try to be in as good of a physical condition as possible. And again, regardless of whether or not Socrates felt that way, this is an attitude that generally a lot of ancient Greek philosophers had. What's interesting about the ancient Greeks is that they did not view the body and the soul or the spirit or whatever you want to call it as two different entities, but they rather saw it as one and the same. Therefore, they encouraged people to keep their body as healthy and as functional as possible so that they can be better as a whole. It was a part of self-improvement. And I think that that's an attitude that we as modern people should also have. I think that's a very healthy attitude to have. But there is another student of Socrates who in his own right was a very respected ancient Greek philosopher who also encouraged this kind of notion that physical exercise is something that should be done by everyone, and that is Plato. What's interesting about Plato is that before he became a philosopher, he had a career as a wrestler. So he himself was an athlete. And what's even more interesting is that Plato was not even his real name, but it was rather the nickname given to him as a wrestler. And basically what this nickname means, as far as I understand in ancient Greek, it roughly translates to broad. Likely referring to his large physical stature. And it would make sense for Plato as a wrestler to have a large physical stature. And this is because one way in which sports in ancient Greece were different than sports today was that in ancient Greece there were no weight categories in sports. And so all of those ancient Greek combat sports such as pancration, boxing, and wrestling, it would make sense for the athletes competing in these sports to try to be as big as possible, because in most sports being bigger, being just physically larger is an advantage. And I can speak as somewhat of a smaller athlete. If there were no weight categories, I would have no chance against, people who are sometimes almost twice my size. And that's why you don't see people in boxing or MMA or any of the modern sports that we have. You don't see lightweights fighting heavyweights and so on and so forth. So it would make perfect sense for these athletes in a context where there were no weight categories to try to be as big, as bulky, as muscular as possible, because unquestionably this is an advantage in any kind of combat sport. So it is not only possible but likely that those people try to be muscular and big. But was this something that applied to the everyday Greek citizen? I would argue no, because again, if we think about it from just a simply rational, logical perspective, trying to be as big as possible, especially in the ancient world, was something that was quite expensive. Eating high quality foods, eating high protein, that would have definitely been quite expensive in the ancient world. And we know that back in the ancient world, there were a lot of athletes who had sponsors who were responsible for their nutrition and who were responsible for providing them with foods like meat, for example, which were, less available in the ancient world than they are today. So I don't think that this is something that the everyday citizen could pursue, trying to be as big and as muscular as possible. That being said, I still think that the ancient Greeks as a society and as a culture perceived, physical fitness and good physical health and physical exercise as values and as virtues. And we can further see this by looking at those famous Greek statues that we all know and love. And even through the eyes of modern people, these statues are perceived as very aesthetic. And those kinds of physiques that are portrayed through those statues are the kind of physiques that many modern people would also strive to have. However, are these statues again reflective of how the everyday citizen looked? Well, no, because for one, they often depict athletes, heroes, and gods. Those are not groups of people that are supposed to look like the everyday Greek citizen. Furthermore, it would make sense for the Greeks to show what the ideal body looked like to them, rather than portray everyday people. I mean, this is even something that we as modern people do in, for example, social media. People don't just post average pictures of themselves on Instagram or whatever, but they try to show themselves in the most positive light. They try to show themselves in the most positive and best image that they could possibly project. And there is no reason why the Greeks wouldn't do the same through their statues. So to summarize about the ancient Greeks, were they a culture where physical fitness was promoted as seen as a virtue? In my opinion, yes. Were the ancient Greeks a bunch of bodybuilders walking around trying to look as jacked as possible? I would say no. That's a fairly silly notion. But that being said, were they a culture where exercise was promoted and where people were generally in good shape? I would say we have enough evidence to conclude that at least a large portion of the Greek citizens at the time exercised and tried to maintain a good physical shape. However, ultimately, all of this is based on speculation. Luckily, however, the next group of people that we're going to look into, we have a little bit more information about the kind of exercise that they did and their diet as well. So we're going to be able to give a little bit more of a definitive answer. The topic of gladiatorial combat is one that has interested me in many years, and I did quite a bit of research on it while I was doing my Spartacus documentary, because I really wanted to, examine the day-to-day life of a gladiator, and I really wanted to understand what their attitude was and how they felt about fighting in the arena. And one of the main conclusions that I arrived at while I was doing my research is that there are a ton of misconceptions about gladiatorial combat that exist today. First and foremost, gladiatorial combat was dangerous and people died in the arena, that's true, but it wasn't really as dangerous and as brutal as it is often portrayed. Again, we can go back to the Spartacus series, where it is shown as this really grueling, bloody thing where people die in droves in the arena. And this is pretty much fantasy. There is really nothing historical about it. And the other misconception is that pretty much all gladiators were forced into this line of work. These were just people that the Romans enslaved, and they just forced them to fight in the arena to the death for the sheer entertainment of the crowds. When, in my understanding, it was really a lot deeper than that. For one, there was a lot of glory and honor fighting in the arena, and this notion that sport is really all about entertainment is really a modern view. I don't think that that's how our ancestors felt about sport. And I'm saying this because I consider gladiatorial combat to be a type of sport. Again, a dangerous sport, but still a sport. And I basically view gladiators as athletes, as there were a lot of people who volunteered to become gladiators, and gladiators in general were very respected in Roman society. And the reason for this is because sports in the ancient world, as I said, they were not just merely entertainment, but there was certainly some kind of a religious element to it. For example, in ancient Greece, and the same goes for ancient Rome, sporting events were held during religious festivals. And in addition to that, if we talk about gladiatorial combat, actually the first instances that we know of gladiators fighting, it happened at people's burials. So again, we can kind of assume that there was this ritualistic religious element to combat and sports in general, but that's kind of besides the point. I'm just explaining this because in my view it is really wrong to look at gladiators as just these slaves that were, nobody cared about them, nobody cared whether they live or die, and they were just thrown into the arena to fight and just whatever happens. But rather there was the sports element. So these people went through rigorous training, they tried to be the best athletes possible, and of course they were also fed the same diet that an athlete would be fed. So let's talk about their diet in training. And here I'm going to talk about another myth that exists about gladiators that is related to this, and that is the notion that gladiators were quote-unquote fat. There's a great video on the topic by Told in Stone, which is one of my favorite history YouTube channels. It's one of the very few YouTube channels about history that I actually like, and I'm going to link it in the description. But I wanted to talk about it just very shortly and kind of express my view on the situation. So I'm not sure where this myth originates from, but basically the idea was that gladiators wanted to have a little bit more fat around their belly to protect their vital organs so that they could, receive cuts and slashes in the arena and survive. And to me, this kind of argument is just completely nonsensical. Like, I really find it idiotic for people to actually believe that, and that is for two reasons. First of all, people in the ancient world, and especially soldiers and gladiators who participated in hand-to-hand combat, often died of their injuries due to infection. And infection was something that was very difficult to treat before antibiotics were invented, and a lot of people met their demise as a result of an infection. So I'm sure that for those people who were very valuable, who were highly trained, where their owners, their lanistas invested a lot of money into their training and diet and so on and so forth, I'm really not sure that they would be okay with them just receiving a bunch of wounds and then hoping that they wouldn't get an infection. And secondly, I don't really see the point of it. Why be overweight on purpose when you can just be lighter, be in better shape, have more endurance, and have less mass for your enemy to aim at. That just makes more sense to me than just having fat to protect your organs from potentially lethal blows. And just as a final argument against this notion, I would point out that there are actually a lot of depictions of gladiators by the ancient Romans themselves, and to me at least, they don't really look fat, with maybe a few exceptions. But anyway, what's great about gladiators is that there have been quite a few studies on their diet, and for the most part we know what the diet of the average gladiator was like. So gladiators were on a mostly vegetarian diet, and the primary foods that they ate were barley and beans. In knowing this, I decided to do somewhat of a thought experiment. I wouldn't really claim that this is scientific or anything like that, but I thought that it's a very interesting thought experiment to kind of see what kind of nutrients they receive through their diet. So there's a tool on the internet that you can find which is called MyFitnessPal, which is basically a tool that people use to count their calories and to count their macronutrients, or their protein, carbohydrates, and fats. So basically the way that it works is you plug in your foods into the tool, and it calculates your calories, how many grams of protein, how many grams of carbs, and how many grams of fats you consume each day. So I thought that it would be very interesting to take this diet of barley and beans and to kind of plug it into that tool, that kind of calculator, and see whether or not this kind of diet was actually conducive to building muscle. So I kind of wanted to see if someone my size, for example, ate this kind of diet, how many grams of protein they would receive, and whether or not that would be sufficient to really build a lot of muscle mass. So basically I am 5'7" or about 170 centimeters. I'm short for modern standards, but my height would be above average for Antiquity, so it would make sense that people who are fighting in the arena, again going back to the size argument, it would make sense that they were above average height. And I weigh about 185 pounds or about 83 kilograms at the moment. And this is extremely subjective, but a person my size, depending on their genetics, their metabolism, their daily activity and exercise, on average, roughly a person my size would consume about 3,000 calories to be in a caloric balance, meaning they're just maintaining their weight. They're not trying to lose weight, they're not trying to gain weight. They're just eating enough calories to maintain their weight. So I decided to see if I ate 3,000 calories per day of equal parts barley and beans, what my macronutrient split would look like. So it looks like this, and you can see that this kind of diet is very high in carbohydrates, very low in fats, and despite what some historians will tell you about the diet of gladiators, it's actually not high in protein, but I would argue is fairly low in protein. In fact, again, I as an athlete eat pretty much twice as much protein every day. But overall, it is not a horrible diet for an athlete, because at least it's high in carbohydrates, and athletes need a lot of carbohydrates basically to recover from the hard training that they do. In fact, if you were to just add a little bit of fatty meat into it, this would amount to a fairly good macronutrient split for an athlete. However, something else that was interesting that I noticed is that if I wanted to eat 3,000 calories of barley and beans every day, therefore just to maintain my weight, I would have to eat over 3 kilograms of food every day, which I can tell you from a personal experience is quite a bit of food. So this plus the lack of protein would lead me to believe that gladiators were not actually that big or muscular. Again, this is all extremely subjective, but this is not a diet that is really that nutritious, at least for modern standards. And again, the lack of meat in there and the lack of protein in general would not really be conducive to making someone bulky and like making them very muscular. So again, in my opinion, the same applies to gladiators. I think that they were in good shape. They exercised, they were probably lean, meaning that they had a low body fat percentage, but I don't think that they were particularly big or muscular. And in the final part of this video, I wanted to talk about soldiers in general, because again, through modern films and media in general, a lot of people have this notion that in order for someone to be a good soldier, especially when it comes to hand-to-hand combat, they have to be jacked. The more jacked they are, the better soldier they are, which I would argue is not necessarily the case. It's actually not the case at all. But I kind of just wanted to look at the lifestyle of a soldier and just think about it rationally. Does it really make sense for a soldier to be very muscular? Does that really make them a better soldier? And is their lifestyle, again, conducive to really building a lot of muscle? So here's the thing. I would argue that to be a good soldier, again, in an ancient context where we're talking about hand-to-hand combat, you do have to be in good physical shape. You do have to be strong, and physical training would definitely benefit an ancient soldier. However, is being really strong and really muscular really beneficial for a soldier? And I would argue no. And I'm saying this because I think that there is a lot of overlap between hand-to-hand combat and martial arts. And I think that, sword fighting or any kind of fighting with, cold weapons, it is basically a martial art. So basically the skill set of a martial artist is very similar to the skill set that a soldier would need to possess. And are combat sports really strength sports? Is it really always the most, the strongest and the most muscular guy who wins? And I would argue that endurance is even more important in a battle. Because let's take an MMA fight, for example. An MMA fight never lasts more than 25 minutes and there are breaks in between rounds. However, ancient battles usually lasted for at least a couple of hours. Sometimes they went on and on for hours. And because of this, I think that carrying a lot of muscle mass would actually be a detriment for a soldier, because the more muscle one has, the more energy they need to feed this muscle. And so in theory, at least on paper, the worse their endurance is going to be. Furthermore, I, as a strength athlete, can say that strength training and endurance training are basically polar opposites of each other. And you can't really get better endurance by doing strength training, and you can't really get stronger by doing endurance training. Well, I guess with the exception of if you're just starting to do physical exercise. But for anyone who has any kind of significant experience doing physical exercise, I believe that those are two polar opposites of each other. So basically, what's the point of getting stronger if that's not going to improve your endurance? So in that sense, I don't think that soldiers were ever really encouraged to be really muscular. And any physical training that they did was in order to improve their, speed, combat ability, and their endurance rather than strength and putting on muscle mass. Also, again, if we go back to the lifestyle of a soldier, something that you have to consider when looking at, ancient soldiers, if we were to take Roman legionnaires, for example, as a case study, a lot of what they did was, walking, cutting down trees, building camps, and so on and so forth. And all of those are activities that are not really conducive to building muscle. They're, for the most part, catabolic activities. You're not going to really become muscular by doing those things. Overall, again, if I just look at it from a pragmatic point of view, I think that soldiers would have been encouraged to do physical exercise in order to be in good physical shape. But I don't think that the training that they had would result in them having big muscles and being really strong, nor would that be practical or even remotely necessary. Okay, so here are my final thoughts on the topic. So if we had to give a general answer on the topic of how good of a shape were ancient people in, I would answer it this way. The strongest and most muscular people of antiquity were not as strong and as muscular as the strongest and most muscular people of today. I would argue that the athletes of today are much better athletes because there are a lot of factors that benefit them. We have decades of research into proper nutrition, exercise science. We benefit technologically through, our modern equipment that we use in order to train. And of course, last but not least, modern medicine also benefits us in the form of performance-enhancing drugs, something that a lot of those actors that portray those ancient people took in order to be in the shape that they were in when they were playing that role. However, in general, I would say that the average person in antiquity was probably in better shape than the average person of today. Unfortunately, one of the downsides of modern society is that it provides a little bit too much comfort, and a lot of people have settled into this sedentary lifestyle where they think that exercise is not really something that is important, and so they don't do it. But I find it really admirable that our ancestors, despite their limited knowledge about, again, nutrition and proper training and all of this, they still managed to be athletes and they still manage to be in good shape. And I think that it's really sad that we as modern people have all of those advantages, yet we, especially in the West, keep getting in worse and worse shape by the decade. If our ancestors managed to be in good shape, we have no reason as modern people not to be in good shape ourselves. Anyway, that's going to be it for this video. I hope it wasn't too chaotic. I hope that I expressed my ideas clearly. Again, if you want to add anything, please let me know in the comment section. I read my comments and I try to respond to all of them. So that's going to be it. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like it, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this in the future, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.